Hey, you guys, welcome to History of Thought 2, and today is our overview of postmodernism. So, for your assignment today, you're going to be listening to episode 118 of the podcast Philosophize This, which is called A Basic Look at Postmodernism. You can also just read the transcript. There's a link to the transcript if you'd rather read than listen. And then we're also going to be covering part of Frederick Jameson's Postmodernism and Consumer Society in this lecture. So Postmodernism and Consumer Society is an essay that Jameson wrote in 1982, which actually became sort of the basis for a larger book that he published in the late 1980s. But part of Jameson is kind of an overview of postmodernism. Then I'm going to have a separate, shorter lecture on Jameson's critique of postmodernism that's found in Postmodernism and Consumer Society as a separate lecture. So what exactly do we mean by the term postmodernism? And this is kind of the hardest thing to think about in terms of how we actually define it. One of the sort of ways that an easy way to think of how to define it is putting quotation marks on everything. So, air quotes on everything, like gender or race or truth or science, right? And Francois Lyotard in the 1970s, who was a French philosopher, sort of one of the early theorists of the postmodern moment, said that postmodernism is incredulity towards meta-narratives. Incredulity towards meta-narratives, right? So what in the hell does that mean? So incredulity towards meta-narratives. So incredulity is sort of, skepticism, or sort of a high level of questioning, or sort of critique, or sort of high criticism of. Okay, not accepting, not believing. So sort of like deep skepticism. So deep skepticism about what? Meta-narratives. So what in the world is a meta-narrative? Okay, well, a narrative, right, is a story. And, we can say, it's oftentimes like not just like a fictional story, but stories that we kind of tell ourselves about how the world works. So meta-narratives are kind of the overarching stories, the overarching mindsets, the overarching worldviews that we have that sort of are the lens through which we view the world, right? Marxism is a meta-narrative, right? A lot of philosophical positions, capitalism could be a meta-narrative. The Enlightenment provides a meta-narrative, right? A lot of religions provide meta-narratives. I mean, so a meta-narrative is sort of this overarching story, this overarching kind of set of assumptions, a set of givens that we don't question about how the world works, right? So postmodernism then is kind of this mindset, this movement that comes into being in the late 20th century, this putting quotation marks on anything that has sort of this very strong skepticism towards meta-narratives, towards these sort of overarching worldviews that purport to sort of give you the truth and explain the way the world works. Okay? So part of postmodernism is sort of questioning these large perspectives, including the Enlightenment. But I also want to take a step back. For us to think about what is postmodernism, we have to understand what modernism is, okay? What modernism is. I'm going to switch out. So I have some postmodernist art here, but I'm going to just show myself so you stop looking at the postmodernist art. So modernism is connected to the idea of modernity. So when does modernity start? When does the modern era start in our eyes? And really, this is co-current in Western history with the Enlightenment, with the rise of science and Enlightenment ideals, but also with industrialization, urbanization, globalization, the spread of capitalism. I mean, we're really talking about the past 200 to 250, maybe 300 years. And philosophically, modernism is really about the spread of Enlightenment ideas and the solidification of Enlightenment ideas and the dominance of these ideas. Applying reason to the human world to find the truth, a postmodernist would say truth, to make things better, belief in the power of human reason, and not kind of a naive or surface enlightenment, this recognition that we may keep messing it up, and humans will always have biases. We can't completely get rid of those, but if we apply sort of the scientific method and reason, we'll kind of get closer and closer to the truth and maybe make a better world, right? This is faith in kind of science and progress and reason. Okay, that's part of the Enlightenment. But also remember, the Enlightenment is also questioning dominant authorities and ways of believing. The Enlightenment also is about skepticism, about critical thinking, about constant questioning, right? This goes back to Kant. Sapere aude, dare to know, right? Questioning those old authorities like the church, like kings, right? Like the aristocracy having special privileges, all of that kind of stuff, right? Questioning all of that. But what's interesting is that postmodernism is kind of pushing against the meta-narrative of the Enlightenment, that we can apply reason to the human world to find truth and sort of progress and make things better. But at its core, postmodernism too also has its seeds in this skeptical and critical part of the Enlightenment. Postmodernism is just pushing this as far as it can go. Postmodernist thinkers would say, isn't belief in Enlightenment principles like reason and science, can't it also turn into a kind of meta-narrative, a kind of authority, and a kind of dogmatism that needs to be critiqued? And, postmodernists say, well, is there even such a thing as the truth? Or are there multiple truths based on our perspective, our context, our history? And what are the negative effects of Enlightenment thinking? Who gets excluded? Who gets pushed out? Who gets made silent? Who gets made, and who gets invisible? And who benefits? So, a lot of thinkers that we've already touched on this semester are deeply involved in these kinds of critical questions and this deep skepticism. And so, on the one hand, that's part of what postmodernism is about. And this sort of pushing that skepticism as far as it possibly can, so that we're critiquing the very notion that there can be anything such as an objective truth. And we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail, and we'll also talk about, some criticisms of this. But first, this is an experiment. I haven't shown a video in a video lecture yet, but when we have live class, I always show these two videos before making this comparison chart. So this is a video series called Design in a Nutshell, and it's a short video on modernism and a short video on postmodernism. So this is sort of design and art focused, but hopefully it helps you wrap your brain around these differences. So hold on. Here we go.
In the early 20th century, the war to end all wars didn't end war at all. It stoked the fires of change. A traumatized world was ripe for change. The world was ready for modernism. Modernists wanted to forget history, or at least reinterpret it. More than just a style, modernism applied to virtually all forms of creative expression. Innovative artists like Picasso, Escher, Dali, they all started looking at their world differently. Other artists tried painting light itself. These were the Impressionists. Surrealists went a bit further. We had entered the age of the isms: Cubism, Symbolism, Futurism, Constructivism. All these new modern ways of looking at the world blew people away. When it came to architecture, modernists were intrigued by emerging technology. Concrete, glass and steel featured heavily in their buildings. Modernists believed that they could design a better society. Ornamental indulgence was considered a frivolous waste of effort. They thought function should always dictate form, and that mankind's intelligence, creativity, and capability for radical thinking should be celebrated. Take the Russian inventor Georgy Krutikov. He suggested an idea for a city held aloft by electrical currents. This at a time when there was barely enough wattage to keep the lights on. Not everything they designed was a resounding success. But you could argue modernism was the single most influential movement of the 20th century. From house music to housewares, tables and chairs to graphic design, all have been created by the aesthetics and ideas of modernism. Do you buy into modernism?
Okay, so now we have postmodernism. Oh, hold on.
In the early 20th...
Nope. Now we have postmodernism.
Postmodernism began at precisely 3 p.m. March the 16th, 1972. Modernism had failed, or at least that's what the postmodernists believed. Modernists had spent much of the 20th century trying to forge a better world, inspired by science and universal truths. To them, less was more. To postmodernists, less was a bore. They believed we needed as many references as possible to determine our own individual subjective conclusions. Art is a good way to try and explain it. Remember Picasso? He created one-off masterpieces based upon predetermined principles of art. His creations rocked the art world, but postmodernists weren't impressed. They believed in more than one method or style. Collage, chance, anarchy, repetition. These were infinitely more interesting. Postmodernists wanted to challenge audiences and force them to ask questions. Postmodern buildings rallied against the blandness that had gone before. The Las Vegas Strip is a great example, a riot of styles, cultures, and whimsical collage. Like any movement, postmodernism had its critics, objecting to unnecessary ornamentation, an obsessive tendency to recycle the past to make something new, and often just plain silliness. The rise of mass media really helped postmodernism take off. The world was interconnected like never before. For many, postmodernism was liberating, giving creative expression a dynamic, often unsettling voice. Postmodernist cinema still confuses, surprises, and delights us. Postmodernist performance still bemuses, and we just can't seem to get enough of quirky postmodern art. Politically, philosophically, creatively, the postmodern movement has proven itself a force to be reckoned with. Like a giant social cattle prod compelling society to question why things are the way they are. And why they aren't. Planning something postmodern?
Hold on, you guys. So that kind of gives you a sense of modernism versus postmodernism in a design sense. But, you know, postmodernism actually is deeper than just art and design, and it sort of describes the cultural moments of the 20th and 21st century. So just real quickly, I don't want to go into this in too much detail. As we talk about this, we'd sort of have class. If this was a live class, we'd stop and talk about each point. But this is kind of a chart sort of comparing modernism and postmodernism. So modernism is really about meta-narratives of history, culture, and national identity. Faith in sort of totalizing explanations in science, history, and culture, right? And the Enlightenment. And kind of one of those main meta-narratives is progress through science, technology, and reason. And sort of faith in social and cultural unity, hierarchies of social class and ethnic national values. I mean, that kind of pushes against the Enlightenment a little bit, but, you know, these new kinds of hierarchies do emerge under Enlightenment thinking and capitalism based on social class. And then, you know, we have the rise of the nation state and sort of the modern nation based on, you know, the fact that we're all American, we're all French, or we're all British, or we're all, Senegalese, or we're all Korean. That's something that also emerges with modernism. A sense of a unified, centered self, individualism, unified identity. faith in personal investment in macro politics, like the nation state or a political party, faith in some kind of depth, that there's sort of a meaning or a value or a content, deeper than just sort of the surface or the appearance or the superficial. Faith in something that actually is real beyond the media and representations, and the authenticity of originals. This is especially true in art. Increasingly this is called into question in the 20th century, even under modernism, but there's still kind of this dichotomy of high versus low culture, low being kind of a popular culture, and high culture being kind of, the arts. Imposed consensus that high culture is better, right? But also simultaneously the emergence with modernism in the 20th century of mass culture, mass consumption, mass marketing. But in terms of art, in a modernist perspective, there's really this idea that art is a unique object and a finished work, that it's authenticated by the artist and validated by agreed upon standards, and that we can have agreed upon standards in modernism. There's a lot of kind of radical art that goes on in modernism, right? Cubism, for example, but even these kind of become accepted as part of the mainstream and validated as kind of great works of art, right? Postmodernism, in contrast, is about the suspicion and rejection of meta-narratives, the deconstruction of these totalizing theories, and the pursuit of sort of local or more contingent theories. Like maybe you can't have this overarching theory that explains all social relations like Marxism, but maybe you can kind of theorize on the local level. Skepticism about progress and even science, and sometimes even anti-technology reactions, an emphasis on social and cultural pluralism, and questioning a lot of the bases that were assumed for social unity, national unity, ethnic unity, a sense of a fragmented and decentered self, multiple conflicting identities. The investment in sort of local politics, micro politics, identity politics, attention to the play of surfaces, images, without kind of this concern for depth or a deeper meaning. Hyperreality, image saturation. We didn't really talk about Baudrillard, simulacra, but you can look up that word. But the fact that sort of the image or the simulation or the representation is actually more powerful than the real, that there are images and text circulating that have no prior original. It isn't sort of a copy of an original, because there is no original, and there's no unmediated experience in life in postmodern times. Disruption of the dominance of high culture by popular culture, the mixing of high and low cultures, and this kind of new valuation of the importance of popular culture. And increasingly, like what we see in the 21st century, what we call demassified culture. So we are, you don't have, 100 million people all tuning into the same 3 TV channels every night, right? We have niche products and marketing, smaller groups, identities. We have this incredible diversity of media so that we can all sort of pick and choose, what we want to consume. I mean, there's still mass consumption, like, 1 billion people will still go see a Marvel movie, but, I can watch some super specialized TV show on Netflix that maybe only 100,000 people watch. And then finally, art as a process, as performance, as production. Art is the recycling of culture, authenticated by audiences and validated in subcultures sharing the identity with the artist, and kind of questioning the idea that there are these common agreed standards of what art is, and even sort of deconstructing the entire notion of art and authenticity. So given all that, I will ask you again, what is postmodernism? So postmodernism really describes this broad movement that developed in the mid to late 20th century across philosophy, across the arts, across architecture, across literary criticism, which marked a departure from modernism. However, it can also describe the general tendencies in Western culture at that time. So even people who are not consciously thinking, I'm a postmodernist, were still kind of living in postmodern times. So these are kind of 2 separate things. Postmodernism, again, can refer to, 1, a particular kind of style in art, in architecture, in design, in literary theory, in academia. But 2, it can also describe a particular historical era in the West. with new forms of social life and economic order, consumer society, society of the spectacle, media-saturated society, multinational capitalism. We could add neoliberalism and globalization, or something we'll talk about next week, late capitalism, all these terms. So as I talked about, postmodernism is typically defined as incredulity towards meta-narratives. That's what Lyotard's definition. An attitude of deep skepticism or rejection of these grand narratives, of these ideologies, of these various things that purport to be universalist. So a meta-narrative is this overarching story that underpins a belief system. So by rejecting such narratives, postmodernists reject the idea that knowledge or history can be encompassed in these totalizing theories. So this includes objective notions of universal human reason, of human nature, ideas about social progress, moral universalism, right? So maybe there's no moral system universally appropriate. The idea of absolute scientific truth, and even sometimes the idea of objective reality. So, for example, a religious purpose to humankind, Enlightenment notions of technological progress, Marxist view of history, these are all rejected as meta-narratives. So postmodernism is about questioning many givens that have not been questioned and deconstructing what is said to be, quote, true or what is unquestioned. So it's about also exposing the power relations that underpin the true or given institutions or ideologies. So what about the supposed truths that upheld and continue to uphold systems of misogyny, racism, white supremacy, homophobia, transphobia, right? It's great to question these things and critically analyze their workings, right? Absolutely. And many of the thinkers we have been reading have been doing this because they're thinking and writing increasingly in sort of these postmodern times. Nietzsche's interesting because he's writing, like 100 years before postmodernism, but he's really seen as kind of the grandparent of postmodernism with his extreme skepticism. But, Foucault, Said, Butler, all of these people are kind of working within that paradigm. Also, kind of instead of the idea of universal truth, with quotation marks, postmodernism asserts to varying degrees that claims to knowledge and truth are products of social, historical, and/or cultural positions. And therefore, truth, quotation marks, is only contextual and is socially constructed, right? And as I said, this really, a lot of this is connected to Nietzsche and his idea of perspectivism, which we discussed many, many weeks ago. So this encourages us to emphasize a plurality of voices and give attention to individuals and groups that have been marginalized. And in questioning a lot of these grand narratives, we allow space for voices that normally would not be heard within the dominant narratives, even, within dominant Enlightenment narratives. But, kind of one criticism of this, sort of the flip side of kind of the plurality of voices and sort of questioning these meta-narratives, is the critique that, postmodernism is really kind of promoting cultural and moral relativism. A lot of people, critics of postmodernism, both on the left and right, would say, upon what basis do we make political, philosophical, and ethical judgments in this postmodern world? Are all views, positions, opinions, even moral systems equally valid? How do we live collectively without shared meta-narratives? This can really kind of sometimes lead to that sense of complete ungrounding, that unmooredness, that foundationlessness, malaise, nihilism. I mean, this is kind of similar to what Nietzsche's thought about the death of God 100 years earlier and what he was afraid it would lead to. But I think a lot of postmodernists would say, but, we still need, it doesn't mean that anything goes. It doesn't mean that sexism is equally, is as equally valid as gender equality, right? But that everything is sort of relative to some extent, or is connected to a particular historical context or a particular cultural context, and that you really have to kind of evaluate moral claims contextually. Postmodernism has offered us tools to dismantle Eurocentrism, white supremacy, religious absolutism, rigid notions of gender and sexuality, but putting science in question marks also allows us to question the truth of global warming, the effectiveness of vaccines? Right? Is science a meta-narrative that needs to be deconstructed? And I mean, clearly there's important critical work about science, right? Whose bodies are used as test subjects without their permission. How different kinds of scientific studies, are biased against certain, people of color, and how science has been used to marginalize people in very immoral kinds of ways. But fundamentally, do we believe that science is a meta-narrative and there is no such thing as, quote, truth? Or, and maybe you're a deep postmodernist, or that the goal is to correct the biases and the discriminatory elements of the way science is done to better arrive at the actual scientific truth. Then maybe you're a modernist. But you can see this debate still goes on even today. And both of these views are really kind of part of our worldview. So what about postmodernism and art and culture? One of the things that we talked about in that big list is that postmodernism is really breaking down kind of the line between high and low culture. So in terms of what people actually consume, under modernism, high art is obscure, it's difficult, it's more critically engaged. Think of looking at a Picasso. And popular culture was seen as dumbed down, mindless entertainment of the lowest common denominator. I mean, think of like Horkheimer and Adorno and their view of mass culture, how it's just basically, the same shit getting recycled and cycled over again in a way just to sort of dumb us to the alienation we're experiencing in capitalism. But, postmodernism really starts to push against this, and really sees popular culture as a site that's worthy of study, but also as a possible site of resistance and a possible site of critical political projects, and not just this site of sort of mindless entertainment. And really kind of breaks down that high versus low distinction. Also, in terms of what gets studied, many academics started studying mass culture, as postmodernism is getting more popular in the 70s and 80s, because they wanted to understand how various ideas, myths, narratives, identities, values get produced and reproduced in society. And at some point, we start valuing these popular culture objects as popular sites of resistance. In the 1980s, there was a lot of studying Madonna and how, is Madonna, a liberated feminist, or is she reinforcing sort of gendered notions and patriarchal structures? And, 20, 30 years later, you get the same sort of cycle of academic articles about Lady Gaga. And I don't really know who it would be now. I don't know, Miley Cyrus. I don't know. But, but postmodernist culture is really sort of taking mass culture seriously, critically, but there also kind of becomes a point where everything becomes a possible site of resistance in mass culture. And we kind of lose sight of Horkheimer and Adorno's argument about kind of the pacifying effects of it. So, it's again, there's kind of this back and forth between the postmodernists and maybe some more Marxist criticisms of the sort of the actual kind of effects of mass culture. Can mass culture actually be a site of resistance? That's a question that's still being debated today. So in terms of postmodern art, in terms of art that explicitly comes under the label of postmodernism, let's say, as an artistic movement, postmodernism describes movements with both arise from and react against or reject trends in modernism. So reacting against formal purity, medium specificity, art for art's sake, the idea of authenticity, the idea of universality, and the conflation of kind of high and low culture in postmodern art through the use of a variety of materials, non-traditional artistic materials, pop culture imagery. Postmodernism also introduced elements of commercialism, kitsch, and general camp aesthetic within sort of this artistic context. And postmodernism styles take from past periods too, such as the Gothic, the Renaissance, the Baroque, and mixes them together so as to ignore their original use in their corresponding artistic movement, this sort of recycling and remixing in play. So in the Jameson article, he specifically talks about how modernism in art was political and cultural commentary. So modernism in like the early mid 20th century. It was commentary on sort of Victorian bourgeoisie middle class values and beliefs. And at the time, it was subversive to the dominant system, right? And to dominant sorts of middle class Victorian bourgeoisie values. But these at the time, which were radical and critical artworks of high modernism, are now part of the canon, right? Picasso isn't subversive, right? He's part of your art history class. So, Jameson says, does this empty them of their subversive power? Modernist works at the time, especially, sort of the, Cubism or Dada, all of these movements were shocking at the time, sometimes even repulsive or subversive or not in good taste. Now they're classics. They had a critical bite. Do they still? But relatively little in postmodern art and culture is received as shocking or repulsive in the same way. I mean, even the most subversive kinds of art. I mean, think of like punk rock in the 70s, sexually explicit art that is meant to shock, kind of are taken in stride by society and even become commercially successful, unlike a lot of modernists in their time, right? So is Jameson right? This is kind of a critique of postmodernism. What's even shocking anymore? I'm going to leave it at that. Jameson has an even deeper critique of all kinds of cultural production under postmodernism, and we'll talk about that in the next lecture.